The following is a presentation of the Reviewing Network Sports. There was no denying that the 2012 season for the Pittsburgh Steelers was an unmitigated disaster, and the first real time that Mike Tomlin faced the pressures of his job coming into effect. And once again, like in 2012, the dominoes continued to fall. Mike Wallace left in free agency for a lucrative deal in Miami. Rashard Mendenhall left for Arizona. Keenan Lewis to New Orleans, Ryan Mundy to the Giants, Will Allen to the Cowboys, Max Starks to the Chargers. And those were just the free agents. But surely the Steelers could find some good pieces in Bruce Gradkowski, Larod Stevens-Howling, Brian Moorman. Oh, shit. The Steelers lost critical key pieces in Willie Colon, but the biggest piece of the last decade of their defense for the Steelers to leave was James Harrison. More on him in a bit. They would need a lot of help in the draft and hope that Jarvis Jones would be the man to fill the void on the defense with their first-round pick. In what ended up being the worst NFL draft class of recent memory in 2013. No, seriously, the 2013 class was such a disaster where tackle Eric Berry was the number one overall pick for the Chiefs. And while there were hits such as Lane Johnson, Ziggy Ansah, Eric Reed, Kyle Long, and DeAndre Hopkins, the first round was an overall bust. After round one, though, the Steelers did find some winners in rookie running back Le'Veon Bell, wide receiver Marcus Wheaton, and a capable backup quarterback in Landry Jones, as well as linebacker Vince Williams. The 2013 preseason comes and it's one to forget. The Steelers never get anything going in out of their 4 games and lose every single one, including an overtime loss to the Chiefs. But remember, the starting roster isn't playing. It's mostly the backups. Surely it's going to get better as the games that matter begin. And oh my God! Yeah, the season started really badly. The first game of the 2013 season saw the Steelers with an early highlight. A 2-point lead over the Tennessee Titans. No, really. The Titans running back Darius Raynard downed the ball at their own end zone to give them a safety and a 2-0 lead. Okay, the season's off to a strong start for the Steelers. Surely it can't end badly, right? Yeah, spoiler alert, it ended badly. The Titans then scored the next 16 points in a sloppy offensive matchup, and the Steelers could barely do anything. It was pretty clear from the beginning the thing that was going to kill the 2013 season for the Steelers was their offensive line, especially with Marquise Pouncey tearing both his ACL and MCL in Game 1 and was out for the season. The Steelers did get a late score to tight end Jericho Cotchery, but it didn't matter. A 16-9 score looks close, but it never was, and it marked the third consecutive 0-1 start for the Steelers. The next week, the Steelers got a Monday night matchup with division rivals, the Cincinnati Bengals, and not only was it another big matchup with a divisional foe. Remember when I said James Harrison was released by the Steelers? That's where he ended up. Cincinnati. The Bengals scooped him up, and so now he gets to face his former team twice this season. The Steelers scored early on a field goal, but like last week, it was never close. The Steelers got blasted by the Bengals 20-10, and for the first time since 2002, the Steelers were 0-2. You would think it can't get any worse than that, but then, Week 3. Another primetime matchup, this time at home against the Chicago Bears. You would think the Bears aren't shit. They haven't played that well this season, and so this should be an easy one, right? Nope. Apparently, Pittsburgh became Chicago for one night, and the Steelers, who haven't won in Chicago since 1995, and it definitely showed that night. The Bears got off to a 17-0 start in the first quarter after several interceptions by Ben Roethlisberger, and by the half, it was 24-7. The bloodbath continued despite a banner night for Antonio Brown. It wasn't enough for the Steelers as they got ass blasted by the Bears 40-23. For the first time since 2000, they are now 0-3. The season seemed pretty much dead on arrival when you are in last place above the Cleveland Browns. That's pathetic. And the worst part of it all was the Steelers' next game was overseas in London, so that already means the preparation is also screwed up. But to make matters worse, the Steelers, in their infinite wisdom and strategy, decided not to leave for London until Friday. 2 days before the game happened, while their opponents, the Minnesota Vikings, were already 3 days in advance. I think you can figure out how this one went. The Vikings once again blanked the Steelers early on up 10-0, but the Steelers would eventually make it a game realizing, oh shit, we drafted a running back for a reason. Yeah, they finally utilized rookie Le'Veon Bell out of Michigan State, and sure enough, he made noise right away. Unfortunately, the Vikings had prime Adrian Peterson, and you can basically kiss your chances goodbye. The Steelers lost again, 34-27, an 0-4 start to the season. The first 0-4 start for the Steelers since 1968, when they went 0-6 to start. The bye week the next week couldn't have come at a better time to try to figure out what the hell to do now, but to make matters worse, Ben Roethlisberger, the franchise quarterback of the Steelers, stirred the pot by making a request to be traded after the Vikings' loss. That's how bad it was getting. Now, later on, Roethlisberger and his agent refuted that request, claiming it was false, but you couldn't really blame him after how terribly the season was starting. With the season getting ugly real fast, the team needed some hope to get the season back on track. That came in a Week 7 game against another bad football team in the New York Jets. Like with other games this season, it was an offensive slugfest, with field goals one after another in the first half. But the good news was that the Steelers did have a 9-3 lead going into the half. And the better news was that in the second half, the offense finally started finding life. A 55-yard touchdown by Emmanuel Sanders, the longest offensive play of the season for the Steelers, in Week 6 nonetheless, broke the cap, and the Steelers pulled away to nab their first win of the season, 19-6. It was a game that felt like the Steelers finally showed up. Granted, it was against the Jets, but still, it's progress. It's a start. It's a step in the right direction. They needed that for their next matchup, especially with the world champion Baltimore Ravens coming to town, with the Ravens coming in on a 3-game streak in Pittsburgh, with embarrassing losses for the home team abound in those games. It would turn out to be a game that would kind of change the fortunes for both teams. The Ravens were 3-2 coming into that game, and the Steelers were 1-4, so the season was definitely on the line for both teams in this mid-October matchup. And it was the Steelers that led for much of this game, leading 13-6 in the fourth quarter. But just like the last 3 times in Pittsburgh, Flacco led the Ravens on a late fourth quarter drive with a touchdown to Dallas Clark to tie the game at 16-16. It looked like we were heading to overtime, but the Steelers were able to get into Shaun Sweesum's field goal range to kick the game-winning field goal at 19-16. The Steelers were getting back on track at 2-4 at just the right time. And then the good luck ended in Week 8 with the Oakland Raiders, once again a place where the Steelers hadn't won since 1995, just like Chicago. The first play of the game, quarterback Terrell Pryor ran the ball 93 yards down the field for a touchdown to take a quick 7-0 lead for the Raiders. And it was all downhill from there. The Steelers tried to get it going in the second half, blanking the Raiders to the 21 points that they had against Pittsburgh in half one, but in the end it wasn't enough. 21-18, 2-5 with New England next. And what did you think was going to happen? New England dominated much of this game, and while the Steelers played to the competition, it was just never enough as New England kept scoring more and more, from Brady to Dobson to Gronkowski to Blunt, more on him a little bit later on. The Steelers tried their best, but it wasn't good enough, losing 55-31 to put them at 2-6, first time since 2006. The tide began to turn, though, after 2 disappointing outings as they took on the Buffalo Bills at home and were able to pull a convincing win against them 23-10 to put them at 3-6. Next up was the Detroit Lions on one of the wildest weather days in NFL history, with a massive storm system causing havoc to other games in the division for both teams, specifically the Ravens-Bears game, which led to an over 2-hour delay for that one. The Steelers started off strong with Antonio Brown getting 2 first-quarter touchdowns to make it 14-0, but then the Lions scored 27 unanswered in the second quarter to make it 27-20 at the half. The Lions controlled much of the third quarter on the ground despite no score, but the moment that changed the game was at the start of the fourth quarter. The Lions were in field goal range, leading 27-23, and could have easily taken a touchdown lead, but for some reason that is still beyond me and pretty much anyone that watched that game, they decided to fake a field goal and go for the touchdown, and I just don't get it, man. And especially considering that move would be costly for them later. The Steelers then drove it 97 yards down the field to score a touchdown to make it 30-27, giving them their first lead since the first quarter. The Lions then went to work, but almost immediately Matthew Stafford threw an interception to Will Allen, and it was clear at that point the game was in the Steelers' hands. An insurance touchdown to Jericho Cotchery cemented the win 37-27 to give the Steelers the 4-6 record. Pre-Thanksgiving weekend saw them going to the Browns for the first time this season for what would be a pretty convincing 27-11 win to put them at 5-6 ahead of a critical matchup with the Ravens. The tide had changed since that Week 7 matchup with the Ravens, as they were 3-2 before that game, but since then, they had only won 2 of their next 4. The Steelers were 2-4 when that game happened, and were now at 5-6. Again, another crucial game for the season with both teams, and it came down to the wire. The game was very close all around, while the Ravens commanded the most points through 3 quarters. And then there was the most memorable moment of the entire game, and it wasn't by any player whatsoever on the field. No. This one was on Steelers head coach Mike Tomlin.
Jones. Look out. Jacoby Jones gets by Sweezum. And taken down at the 27-yard line.
Oh yes, that moment. On the ensuing kickoff, Mike Tomlin was standing just off the field along the Steelers sideline as Baltimore's Jacoby Jones broke free on the return for a potential game-breaking touchdown. Tomlin, with his back to the approaching play, appeared to glance over his shoulder and then place his foot briefly onto the field as he jumped out of the way, causing Jones to veer inside where he was tackled. Several Ravens players claimed Tomlin had intentionally interfered with Jones. If officials had agreed, a touchdown could have been awarded to the Ravens based on the palpably unfair act. However, no penalty was called, but then a week later, the NFL fined Tomlin $100,000. And yes, you can make the argument that it was an accident, but let's be honest, and this is coming from a Steelers fan, that was Tomlin's former frustration for how the last 2 seasons had gone, and it was a pretty pathetic play on his part. I get it. The team has been rough to watch this season, but there's no excuse for that whatsoever. And like I said, even somebody like me who defended this guy for the longest time can look at that and go, yeah, that's a dick move on your part. Like, I would tell that straight to his face. Like, I've respected you for a number of years, but when you did that to Jacoby Jones, just because of how badly the season went, just kind of like, what I'm trying to say is that that was a dick move on your part. That's what I would have said to him. And I would say it that way too, because I would try not to say it in a way that would make me sound like a complete asshole, but what other way can you say, yeah, it was a dick move without sounding like an asshole? But anyway, back to the game. But alas, the Ravens did make them pay by winning the game 22-20 and dropping the Steelers to 5-7 on the season. On yet another wild weather day in the NFL, seriously, there was a lot of them in 2013, the snow-covered Heinz Field played the Steelers hosting the Miami Dolphins in a game that many would think would be a cakewalk win for the home team, but like everything else, it wasn't that at all. Miami made it the game going back and forth with Pittsburgh, but in the end, the Dolphins had a 34-28 lead with one last chance for the Steelers. Under a minute to go in the quarter, the Steelers got the ball back with Roethlisberger throwing to Brown and then Brown running for what seemed to be the game-tying and eventually game-winning touchdown in PAT. However, officials reviewed the play, and it was determined that Brown had stepped out of bounds during the run, ending the game, dropping them to 5-8. Tomlin got karma put on him for the week before, as once again, a pivotal play on the sideline cost them dearly in the end. At 5-8, the Steelers seemed doomed, especially with the division-leading Cincinnati Bengals coming into town in primetime next week. A lot was riding on this game for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who could have easily been eliminated with a loss to Cincy. But the Steelers rose to the occasion right away. A 21-0 start to the game was just what the doctor ordered, and despite a noble effort by the Bengals in the fourth quarter, the Steelers won 30-20 to keep them alive at 6-8 in the playoffs. Next up was a Super Bowl 45 rematch with the Green Bay Packers, who were also fighting for their playoff lives with Aaron Rodgers out for much of the season, and the Steelers were lucky enough not to face him this time around with backup quarterback Matt Flynn as the starter. The game was competitive for the first 2 quarters, but a dominant 21-point third quarter, including a pick-6 touchdown for the Steelers, put them at 31-21 at the end of the third. But the Packers never gave up and tied the game with less than 2 minutes to go. It was then followed by a bizarre play by the Packers on a 3rd and short, where Matt Flynn fumbled the ball at their own 17 and Troy Polamalu nabbed the fumble to put the Steelers in scoring position. It was then followed by Le'Veon Bell, eventually making it into the end zone to make it a 38-31 game. The Packers had one last chance, but it was too little too late, and the Steelers, who seemed dead at 5-8, still had slim playoff hopes. The Packers were hurt a bit too, but the good news was that the Bears, who were ahead of them, got ass-whipped by the Eagles to keep their hopes for the playoffs alive for next week's matchup against said Bears. As for the Steelers, they needed help for the team to sneak into the playoffs as the 6th seed. And on paper, it didn't seem like much. Simply beat the Browns at home, and then watch to see if the Chargers lose to Kansas City later on in that day. The first half was easier said than done, as the Steelers dominated the Browns 20-7, but then they had to watch the Chiefs and Chargers, and it almost was a late Christmas miracle for the Steelers, but a missed field goal by Chiefs kicker Ryan Succop in the final minute of regulation, which would have sent the game to overtime and likely secured a playoff spot for Pittsburgh. So for the second year in a row, the Pittsburgh Steelers were eliminated from the playoffs, making it the first time since 1999 and 2000 that the team missed the postseason in back-to-back seasons. But all things considered how the season began, the fact that the Steelers were even in this position that they were in was unbelievable. And while there were big flaws both offensively and defensively, the Steelers definitely showed more signs of promise across the board at the end of the 2013 season than they did at the end of the 2012 season. Ben Roethlisberger, despite the trade request, did put together a good campaign with 28 touchdowns and 14 interceptions, throwing for over 4,000 yards for the third time in his career. Antonio Brown had his best season yet with nearly 1,500 yards and 8 touchdowns, and rookie running back Le'Veon Bell showed some life in his first campaign with 8 touchdowns of his own and 860 yards total. The defense struggled without the likes of James Harrison, finishing 30th out of 32 teams in total yards allowed and 16 in points allowed. It was the definition of a mixed bag season, and you can just tell that the team was missing a lot of key pieces from the previous season. But the second half of the season showed the promise that the team had to get them back on track. It would only require some more refining on the offense and defense to make that possible come next season.